Welcome everyone joining right now for the Increasing Velocity and Productivity of Engineering Teams webinar with PlanetScale and Prisma. I want to go over a few housekeeping things before we get started. The audience is muted, just so anyone knows that. The event will be recorded, so if you need to leave or if you're coming in later or you want to share it with your team later, you will be able to do that. And if you have any questions, submit them in the Q&A widget in Zoom, and we will get to those at the end. So feel free to put those in throughout any part of the conversation. If something, you have a follow-up question that one of the panelists mentions. I want to first introduce you to our three panelists. First is Nick. Nick is the VP of Engineering at PlanetScale, a company that you'll definitely be familiar with by the end of this. Before joining PlanetScale, he was the Director of Engineering at GitHub and worked across multiple teams and organizations on APIs, infrastructure, and more. Outside of work, he lives in Seattle, Washington, and spends much of his time as he can off the computer and in nature. Our second panelist is Hervé. Besides a growing passion for building guitars, Hervé is in love with understanding developers and identifying opportunities to make their jobs easier. He's worked at Google, Contentful, and is now the VP of Product at Prisma. And our last panelist is Brian. Brian is the CTO at Superwall, a startup helping consumer subscription companies increase their revenue. Before joining Superwall, he spent a few years in security at GitHub and has always been fascinated with making developer lives easier, especially when it comes to security and reliability. And I'm Taylor Barnett. I am in Austin, Texas, and I work as a staff developer advocate at PlanetScale. I've worked at a handful of other developer-facing companies, all focused on data, APIs, and developer experience. I first want to also let each of the companies represented here just give a quick 30 seconds about who they are, and we'll first kick it off with Nick.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Taylor, and thank you all for attending. If you're on the Zoom live stream or listening to the recording, we really appreciate you taking the time. So PlanetScale is a MySQL compatible serverless database platform. You can read that on this slide. That's basically the elevator pitch. More broadly, what PlanetScale is a database that is more than just a database, but a development platform. Our goal is to help companies who are growing and building do that more easily without worrying as much about their database. So we provide for easy scaling, developer tooling to make it easier to make database changes, easier to undo bad database changes, and better insights into how your database is performing. Basically, we live and breathe databases so that you and your teams don't have to, and you can focus on getting the other parts of your stack, the other parts of your business built while not worrying too much about the database. And that's PlanetScale in a nutshell, and we'll talk a little bit about how we use it and why we think it's so special throughout this webinar.
Next, we have Prisma.
Yeah, thank you, and hello everyone. Yeah, so Prisma is on a mission to make it really delightful for application developers to work with databases in a modern stack. So I think to bounce on what Nick said, we're looking at the data access layer, what sits in between the database and the different databases that you may want to work with, and your application code, your API. And so we do that by offering an open source ORM that gives you a type-safe API, auto-generated migrations. And we also recently launched a Prisma data platform in GA in June, which is about helping teams to work with their application in production. So one of the core features of the data platform is a data proxy that really make it possible to work with traditional databases in a serverless or edge environments like Cloudflare or Vercel Edge Functions, for example. So that's it in a nutshell. Yeah, you can read more probably in the slide or hit me up otherwise.
And Superwall.
Everyone, so at Superwall, we're customers of both Prisma and PlanetScale. And so I'm here to share a little bit about what we've built on top of their tooling. So basically, we're on a mission to help consumer subscription apps monetize their offerings to their customers and increase their revenue. So what that looks like is A/B testing everything around their upsell process. So testing pricing, copy, where in a user lifecycle you decide to show an upsell, things like that. So we were founded about 1.5 years ago. We're slowly adding more customers. We recently raised a seed round from Y Combinator, Adjacent, Weekend Fund, and Shrug. And we recently hit a milestone of being installed on 2% of iPhones globally. So we have this really interesting kind of usage profile where we have a very small number of kind of like core customers, like a small number of apps, but then their customers, the end users, are very, very big. So as an SDK company, we have this interesting pattern where we have to be at the scale of all of our customers combined. And as a very small team, working with very big companies, that is challenging. And so, yeah, we're here to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we'll definitely dig into that. And I guess you're on my phone because I use Planta to take care of my plant for my house plants. So
you can try it.
You're on my
premium
phone right
offering
now.
is great.
I do pay for it. Yeah. So yeah, that's awesome. Let's first kind of set the scene to help everyone kind of understand what's going on with our different engineering teams and the engineering teams that use our different tools. What does your technology stack look like today in terms of like in the context of data, and why did you pick some of these tools? Nick, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So of course we use PlanetScale to build PlanetScale. So we have a number of PlanetScale databases that power various parts of our application. So if you've ever used PlanetScale, you have indirectly used PlanetScale. And then on top of that, we have a few different stacks, a Ruby on Rails API backend that powers a lot of the kind of core engines, workflows, and state machines and things like that that make PlanetScale possible. And then the web application that you interact with is a React front end that uses that backend Rails API to present you with the beautiful information in the PlanetScale stack. And then we also use PlanetScale Connect to get our data out of PlanetScale and put it into a data warehouse for our analytics teams and data teams and things like that to be able to actually make use of what our users are doing and give us some business insights. So it's kind of a pretty traditional stack. I personally am a big believer in doing boring things that scale. Picking Ruby on Rails in 2020 was maybe a slightly controversial decision for some, but it's really done us well in terms of developer productivity. And pairing that with PlanetScale has really been a dream. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of how we do that later in this webinar.
Brian, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I broke my own rule that I guess is Nick's rule of not just using Rails. So we chose to use Prisma and a full TypeScript stack, and it's actually worked out really well for us. A short anecdote: we hired a front end engineer recently, and he's been doing great working on all these front end features. And I was like, oh well, why don't you just do the whole thing? And we have a full TypeScript stack end to end. And so he was like, oh, this is how you access the database. This is super simple. So he was able to ship his first full stack feature like yesterday. So our stack is kind of next on the front end, Prisma on the back end, some Blitz mixed in, and then PlanetScale is our main database.
Urbain, do you want to? Go for it.
I guess that's on me. So yeah, just to caveat, I'm a VP of product and not a VP of engineering. So I have probably more of a surface understanding of everything involved there. But yeah, we're vastly a Postgres shop. And so the reason being that we had prior knowledge on that database specifically. We know it scales well. We know it pretty well. Prisma is written in Rust, so we had like a strong performance requirements. Wanted a strong typing system. So the core engines, as we call them, are built in Rust, and we have TypeScript as a layer to generate the client, as well as the CLI. And the platform is a Next.js TypeScript full stack application running on Vercel, a bit of AWS Lambda, and the data proxy is a Kubernetes plus a cluster running the query engines that actually are also living in the client and then scaling them up and down in an AWS cluster in multiple regions. That's roughly where we're at. In terms of databases, we also use BigQuery for some of the metering and analytics on the side as well.
Cool. Yeah, I know we also do a little bit of BigQuery and other analytics stuff. I don't know if Nick wants to just mention those, but yeah. So I think the first like kind of diving into this like topic is like, I think velocity and productivity mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so I'd just be curious, what does that mean for your teams? What does velocity and productivity mean to you?
I can take that first if you want, Taylor.
Go for it.
So I think velocity is one of the most important parts of building a successful business. If you think about cycle times and if you think about competition and what it takes to actually become successful, it's all about being able to work faster and more efficiently than your competition or than other companies. That doesn't mean putting more hours in necessarily. Some businesses may choose to have low velocity and fix that by doubling the amount of hours everybody works. But at PlanetScale, our goal is to get the most out of every day. We actually have a core value, every day matters at PlanetScale. And one of the biggest ways to really feed that value is to increase velocity. So for us, what that means is making sure that our software engineers and really everyone at PlanetScale can be unblocked as much as possible and can be as levered as possible. So that means buying tools, investing in technologies, investing in parts of the platform that mean that every engineer has as much leverage as possible. It's as few keystrokes, as few button clicks as possible to get the most amount of work done. So we've used tools like PlanetScale, we've used tools like GitHub and all of the GitHub automation CI/CD pipelines to make sure, for example, that our entire Rails test suite completes in under a minute, kind of P99, and that it's a click of a button to deploy that to production. So our engineers don't have to sit around and wait for their tests to pass and fail. It means that we want to make sure our database changes can be done successfully, queued up, so we're not babysitting and making sure that we're spending 3-4 days to get a database change out into production. It means leveraging things like Prisma or leveraging things like these kind of other technologies that are really crafted not just around being good technology, but around being technology that developers can use and understand and leverage to be more productive. So for us, what it really means is getting the most ROI out of every hour that we spend advancing PlanetScale. That is our North Star for when we buy tools. That is our North Star for when we adopt technologies. Of course, they have to be good technology. We're not going to adopt something that doesn't work because it purports to, give us more velocity or more productivity. But at the end of the day, the way that, especially in today's environment, the way that businesses are successful is by picking the things that help the folks who work there just get more out of their hour. You could hire 2 developers, or you can hire 1 developer and give them all of the tools that they need, and they'll run circles around a team of 3 developers if they're as productive and can be unlocked to their full potential. So that's how we think about this, and that's why we've adopted tools, and that's why we're building tools like PlanetScale to give that ability to other teams to not have to worry and to not have to get stuck and sit around and go, well, when can we get this out, or is this going to break? No, we need to move swiftly. And we need to be able to unblock ourselves every minute, every day, and every hour. And that's what productivity and velocity mean to us at PlanetScale.
Brian, I'd be curious, your team is smaller because y'all are, an early stage startup. Like what is velocity and productivity for you?
Yeah, I think a lot of the values that Nick touched on, we adopt those as well. I think one of the biggest shifts we've had, or I've had personally, moving from a bigger company at GitHub to being 5 people, is just looking for really solutions to problems. I never thought I'd be so willing to trade money for not having to think about something or not having to hire someone. People are so expensive. They're wonderful, and we love the team we have, but they're so expensive compared to buying solutions that kind of can work off the shelf. And as I alluded to, especially in the database world, we use PlanetScale as our primary database, and then we have a ClickHouse instance for analytics, and we chose to basically pay companies who are really good at running those things, so that we wouldn't have to. And also we're also not database experts by any stretch, and so having something that is going to work and kind of alert us to us doing something wrong. Recently, we found in the Insights tab a table scan from a really simple query that should have been 3 milliseconds was scanning one of our biggest tables, which is millions and millions of records. So stuff like that, where tools can surface issues and kind of allow us to be experts without really knowing the nitty gritty of what we're doing.
Totally. Yeah. Everybody, I'm curious, like, what are some of your user struggles that you've seen when working with data and databases?
Yeah, that's a vast question. I think the way I would break it down is depends a lot on the type of developer we're talking about. So it's interesting to roughly segment. Of course, like no one falls in a bucket, but like there's roughly two broad categories. So you have people who have basically started off from a front-end experience. I think actually you talked about someone like that, Brian, which is super interesting. Is they're very much a sweet spot for Prisma. They basically get their way into full stack because it's TypeScript as well. So it's like the language barrier is out. Also, serverless has made like these backend and front end so close together in the same code base nowadays with technologies like Vercel and Netlify and so on. That really makes the database the next frontier to some degree. And so that's like for them, the problems are just understanding SQL, understanding the complexity of database, understanding the problems that backend development comes with, like, I don't know, race conditions, things that just don't naturally think of when developing in a front-end environment. So that's, let's say, roughly a broad category. The second is I call like backend devs who pretty much know about SQL and databases, yet they just don't want to get bored by the 80% of kind of traditional simple stuff that they just want to have a nice API, be faster, more productive, have type safety just as a way to control, like when a code base grows, that something's not going to break. So really keeping that confidence in their code base. And for them, it's just keeping the 20% of where their expertise is needed. And so having a way to break off the system in a nice and smooth way, so they can really go about optimizing that last 20%. So they can put their expertise at very good use. And for them, the problems are slightly different. That's usually going to be about really optimizing down the database, like, for example, slow queries that are really difficult, or, I don't know, repartitioning some, like a database into multiple shards, looking into implementing a multi-tenancy service if you really start to look at like larger scale. These things are really, really big deals and really complex. And for them, it's really a different kind of story.
Totally. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, we see, I think at PlanetScale, we see a lot of those two categories very much too. Nick, I'd be kind of curious how just one example of like, how does PlanetScale use PlanetScale internally?
Yeah, so I know Brian mentioned PlanetScale Insights, and I have a very similar anecdote of a time that it was really useful for us that I would love to talk and talk about why it's kind of so powerful. So when we released Insights a few weeks ago or a couple of months ago, of course, the first thing I did was went and checked our main PlanetScale database's Insights to see how it was doing. And the first thing I did was sort by the most number of queries and kind of most number of time taken up, kind of wondering which query would be on top, thinking it would be one of those queries that does a table scan to dump data, or one of those expiring old data that does a delete from with a big where clause and kind of takes some time. And what it actually was a feature flag query. We had done something like 6 trillion feature flag queries or 6 trillion rows scanned with a feature flag query. Now, each one of them only took 3 or 4 milliseconds, but we were clearly doing this tens of times a second, 24/7, 365. And not great, it adds load to the database, and it means probably maybe every page load or, some user action is kind of taking all of this time to do this. And so that insight let us go do a little bit of investigating and do a little bit of digging. And we found out that, yes, not only were we doing way too many feature flag queries, every single job that we run, and we run a lot of jobs, every single page load, but we also had some feature flags that had a bunch of users in them, and all of those were being loaded kind of every time someone loaded a page or everyone did a request. So in about 48 hours, we were able to turn that around, use the feature flag system better, stop preloading our feature flags in that way, and stop scanning on the order of tens of thousands of database rows a second, all because we were able to look at the PlanetScale Insights feature, just kind of dive into the data a little bit and just start picking down the worst to the best and optimizing our database usage. And this is why I think these tools that we're all talking about up here are so valuable. You don't have to buy an additional piece of software. You don't have to become a DBA or an expert. You can go sort by the worst to best, pick it off and say, is this bad? And if it's bad, you can go dive in and figure out how to make it better. And that's the power that we want to put in every developer's hands at PlanetScale. And that's the power that we ourselves use for making sure that we're actually building good software. We probably never would have caught that. We never would have done all of the work because it wasn't perceived as a performance problem. It was fine. But because we had this tool in front of us, because we could go take a look, we dove into the data and we found opportunities to make PlanetScale significantly better. And that's what a good tool does. A good tool helps people use it. And now, even for PlanetScale, this might be working against our own interests. We want people to be reading more data. We want people to be consuming more PlanetScale. But what we want more than that are people to be successful with the tool. So we're more than happy to give people the tools to do that because we know, when all is said and done, we want people to grow their businesses. We want people to be win with PlanetScale, and this is how you do that.
Yeah, and I mean, it often comes down to PlanetScale's users and their experience. If their app is loading, if we're having, slowness, it's gonna make their users unhappy, and then they'll have to deal with the complaints, and it'll just like filter up. I'd be kind of curious, has there been any experiences with Prisma, using Prisma, like for example, on like the data platform that y'all kind of had any interesting experiences with?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're also strong believers of drinking our champagne, as we call it, and so we're using the Prisma data platform specifically to actually share access with different roles and permissions on the database that is powering the Prisma data platform. So that helps our support team to figure out if a project is hung up for some reason, or like reset some access or changes some things. That's a pretty simple first use case. And we also use the data proxy ourselves to, well, let's say, contain the potential problems with connection pooling and how using Prisma data platform starts to scale. So those are very concrete use cases of us using our own Prisma data platform. Prisma Studio and the data browser that's part of the Prisma data platform are both using the Prisma client under the hood. So we well, again, like trying to really use that just speeds up the pace at which we can build stuff. That also helps us uncover very, very real use cases that we hope other users would find out and just uncover some of these bugs or some problems or gaps and fix them. So as we make ourselves more successful, we also make users more successful. And yeah, the Prisma data platform itself is also built using Prisma. So we essentially really try hard to make most use of Prisma as possible.
Yeah, awesome. I'd be kind of curious, Brian, how has working with a stack like with Prisma and PlanetScale like changed the way that you work with data than compared to, even over a year ago?
Totally. Yeah, there's a few things that jump out.
Yeah.
I remember one of my first jobs, I locked like our Postgres database in production a few times, like not knowing what migrations I was applying. So I haven't done that to date, which is like a great win. Our customers are very happy that they don't have to rely on my like specific like nitty gritty SQL knowledge to like not take down their access. And then looking back at another company experience, like we would open a pull request asking for changes, and then someone would come and manually apply them to our database, and like I don't know what magic they were doing, really. And so between those two experiences, basically being able to open a deploy request and just click, run, and it run, that's like a huge win. And so we've really kind of like gone crazy with that, where when we open a pull request, we'll create a branch that matches the branch in GitHub. We'll apply any migrations that are on that branch to the branch in PlanetScale. And then we'll compare to see if our main branch in PlanetScale has less migrations applied than our one for this feature request, and then we'll automatically open the deploy request. So basically on like through our CI, we'll basically have a button that pops up, like in our GitHub pull request saying like, oh, here's some changes we found to apply to the database. Do you want to make them? And so it's gone from this like scary, nerve-wracking thing to like maybe even more routine than making some code changes, which is kind of like a shifting like all the way across the scale for us. So it's been a pretty big win. Does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, totally. That's a great example of it. Before we get to the last couple of questions, I'd just be curious, Hervé, you mentioned earlier this concept of like data access. Like what is, that's a term that's been around for a while, but y'all are kind of looking at it in the modern sense, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, yeah, that's the history is like data access layer. I mean, I used to be an engineer in the Java world and the NT architectures and so on, and data access layer has like a very specific layer of the app that was in charge of essentially doing the access to the database and fetch that and map that to objects that can then be later used by the business logic of your application and for serving the APIs that were matching more of the front end needs. So that's coming from that, I would say. But like I like to break it down into essentially the two pieces, like data and access. And so data is just essentially everything related to what the data your application needs. So where is that stored? How is that broken down? Where is that located? And some of these things. And access is covering quite a lot of the other pieces, like who can have access to that. So role-based access control coming to play. And how is that best accessed by the application depending on the application's needs? So it's like data access patterns from the application. So let's say you have a super heavy read path in your application, you want to probably structure your database in a way that makes that a lot more efficient than having a very well normalized view that is super well understood, but that performs quite poorly. So this is really about then this other aspect of how does the application make use of that data. So I guess that's like really summarizing that, and we're really trying to simplify that process of figuring out how to make use of the data the application needs in the most efficient way possible. That's the high level summary of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, and that only helps make our teams more productive. I think my last question for everyone, I want everyone to curious what your thoughts on this. What does developer experience mean to your teams? When, you know, sometimes the thing is like, sometimes when you're moving faster, the developer experience often can decrease occasionally, or just like different areas don't get as much attention. So like what does developer experience mean to your teams? Whoever wants to go first with that.
Yeah, I can start there. Yeah, I think the couple main tenets that we think about is like confidence, you know, knowing what changes I'm making and being confident that they're going to be routine and I'm not just, you know, waiting for something bad to happen. And then kind of like interoperability or an understanding of the system, like an ability to plug in and recognize patterns and kind of contribute to a part of the code base that you haven't seen before. And then I think the third thing would just be in the whole tooling world, like having tools that prevent us from doing the wrong things. So that looks like TypeScript, you know, removing a whole class of bugs that I hated when I was working in the Rails world. Migrations being applied safely, things like that. Those are kind of the three main tenets that I'd think about.
Yeah, I'll follow on and say I completely agree with you. You know, I think about what developer experience means to me is really your ability to operate, change, and maintain, you know, kind of a system. So it's one thing to have something sitting in production that you can totally forget about, walk away from, and it just works well. But, you know, I think studies show, and certainly my personal experience would bear out, that the majority of incidents or problems or challenges happen when you're changing a system, not when the system is in a steady state. So having the confidence that whatever you're modifying will tell you when something goes wrong, will tell you when something goes wrong before you ship it. So like, you know, good tests, and to Brian's point, you know, part of the best things about working with type safe languages is the type system that prevents a whole you know, types of bugs. But more importantly, right, it's a system that gives you the information that you need. Imagine a car without a speedometer, or imagine a plane without an altimeter. Those are bad developer experiences. You'd have to go look out and say, you know, am I going faster than everyone else? Or start counting how many lines you pass every 10 seconds. And those are systems without good developer experience. They force you to do the extra work, when in reality, this should just be something presented to you. You should have it, be able to internalize it, and you can move more safely with it. And then it's also just something that developers know, or anyone really know how it works. So we don't expect everyone to have a completely intimate knowledge of how an automobile or how a plane works, but you know that the gas and the brake are how you go and how you stop. And so the more that systems can expose the right level of abstraction to developers, again, the more leverage that they can have to be able to use it and be more successful with it. So when we think about how we're buying tools and how we're using tools and how we're producing tools, it's all about giving people the right level of abstraction. And it's all about giving people the right level of knobs and tools so that they're not overwhelmed like the cockpit of a 747, but they're also not underwhelmed like a Apple car with no steering wheel, no speedometer, just one button that calls Siri, and you get to tell Siri where you're going. That's bad developer experience as well, even though it obviously would take a ton of work to write it. You have to hit the sweet spot so that people can be safe and secure in how they change, but also get done what they need to get done and not have that ability taken away from them.
Hey, so there's a lot of good stuff already said. So I'm gonna maybe take what's the opposite of DX. So the opposite of DX is essentially toil work, fighting the system, the framework, basically staying away from the critical path of what you're trying to do. That's like I'm no longer I'm a developer, but effectively once you really start to feel like you're spending way too much time on figuring out that configuration so that you can really get going, it's really when this is a very clear manifestation of the anti-pattern of DX. So I like this idea of considering that this is about keeping developers in the flow. So when you're in the flow, you really feel really productive, you feel energized, you feel, well, sometimes really delighted. So there's this sort of moments of joy that I believe I heard also mentioned a few times. That really gives you the sentiment of moving really fast towards the direction you have. So that's also how like these things can really be unpacked into very concrete concepts. That's why, for example, auto-completion to me is a very, very clear artifact of DX. That you stay in your IDE, you get the automatic disclosure of what is possible to do. So that gives you that confidence you're fast because you don't have to move away from it. You don't have to go back and forth. You don't have to do all of that work. You just like continue fluidly to write what you have in mind. And so that keeps you in the flow, that keeps you productive. So that's, and yeah, a lot of other things that were said before, but essentially this sense of matching with patterns that are known is really effectively important, because otherwise you're up for defining a new standard and bringing people on board, and that's a big long journey. So instead of like matching what people do traditionally expect is also a very good way to keep people very accommodated with your software in a much faster fashion.
Awesome. Yeah, that's I like, yeah, what is it not? That's a great way to answer that. I know we're over time. I'm just going to ask a couple of these Q&A questions that people had sent in when they signed up, and maybe we can kind of, you know, unless you feel very strongly, don't feel like you have to have an answer for it. One of them was related to developer experience. They said, is minimizing the number of steps or amount of typing to complete a job to be done a fair metric for measuring developer experience?
I can take that. I'll say that's not the metric that that I use. I think the metric that I use would be more like if it's 4:30 on a Tuesday, am I going to go ahead and complete these steps? Are they easy enough or obvious enough or something like that? Or am I going to leave for the day and then do it tomorrow morning? So we think of it as activation energy. Am I going to step away for coffee, come back, and then not do it because I forgot what place I was in or it took too long? I'm willing to type quite a bit if I can be productive, right? All coding really is typing weird symbols into a computer and hoping that the computer agrees with what I want the symbols to do. So when I look at that, I look at making it clear, obvious, and lowering the barrier to getting it done. Not necessarily as few steps as possible, but of course, putting people through unnecessary steps and things like that is just as bad. But to me, I look at it like, is the solution something that people are excited or interested or want to use? Or do they put this off and dread it because it's convoluted or complicated or difficult?
Yeah, I try to think, how much Googling am I going to have to do to get this done? Yeah. We didn't get to touch on this one as much, but if anybody has any strong feelings, how do you feel like is the right time to evolve a process as the organization grows? You know, too early and it introduces too much friction, too late and you're fighting multiple fires at the same time.
I can maybe give it a try. I think there's something we like to use was you have to feel the pain a little bit before you start putting in a process. Like otherwise it's like premature optimization, like in designing a software for something that may never happen, like the Yagni or like principle. I think it's a bit the same with processes. So once you start realizing like things becoming a mess, stuff happen, you like people don't know about them and they start feeling confused. This is like you have something to solve. And then process comes in and it's welcome because people see the change is needed. Otherwise, it might just feel like an overhead and you like don't really understand why you should go about doing something new. I guess it's a pretty interesting principle to keep in mind and just follow that.
Yeah. And then I think let's end on this question, since this is kind of wraps up a little bit of this conversation, and we've touched on it a little bit, I think. How do you choose the right tool for a project? You know, we've talked about picking tools, basically. And in some ways we've picked ourselves, but also maybe Brian, you have some insight into like how to choose a right tool, especially when you talked about the cost factor.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I kind of alluded to this, but I'd say, pick a tool that gets the job done, like you can look at, this spec sheet and think about, oh, well, this tool has XYZ feature and this has this, and you can kind of compare them. But I think we're all pretty aligned in saying like the point of writing software is to like get it to do the thing you want it to. And so like, that's kind of how I always frame that, that question, like what's going to get me to the end goal. And so like, for me personally, I'd worked with MySQL a bunch at GitHub, so I was like pretty familiar with that. We had been working on developer tools before we pivoted into what we're working on now. And so we played with Prisma, we played with the TypeScript ecosystem. So we kind of, took some of what we knew, some exciting new things that we had like some familiarity with, and kind of came to the stack we're at. And so I think we've maintained a certain flexibility, like we're willing to throw things away if it's not working for us, we're willing to adopt new things. But at the core, like the most important bits, we've definitely tried to rely on things where we trust their current process, and even maybe more so, we trust the trajectory. So like we've made a big investment in PlanetScale and Prisma based on trust of where they are now. Like we were very early adopters. Like I think I messaged Nick on Twitter and he might have even told me not to use PlanetScale at the time because it was like so nascent. But I was like, no, you guys will figure it out. It'll be great. And so, yeah, we've kind of made that investment, and we're trying to grow with with our vendors and with our suppliers. So I think, yeah, betting on where you are now, what you're comfortable with, and then seeing where you think things will go in the future, and kind of like what growth that you can be a part of.
Any last thoughts on that before we wrap up?
And just one last tiny bit is like we also use the familiarity of the current team with whatever we want to choose as a big factor. Sometimes not maybe the best tool, but at least that's the tool that will get the team you have like the most productive at the point in time we're in. And so that's another one we use quite a lot.
I think that's very true for Ruby on Rails at PlanetScale for sure. Totally awesome. Well, thank all y'all so much for joining us. I'm sorry that we're over time. I don't want to hold anyone much longer. There were a lot of great questions that were sent in earlier, and we'll try to like figure out how to maybe put out some answers and some content and stuff because there were some great questions. Thanks so much. And we'll get a recording link later to this if you want to return to it. And yeah, thanks again for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.